In the cockpit of the Sukhoi Su-9 interceptor, the most critical instrument wasn't the attitude indicator, the altimeter, or the airspeed dial. It was a specialized set of command needles mounted prominently on the panel, driven not by the aircraft's own sensors, but by a radar operator sitting in a concrete bunker hundreds of miles away. The pilot of this Mach 2 interceptor was not expected to hunt, maneuver, or think tactically. Instead, they were expected to perfectly center those needles, turning their aircraft into a blindly obedient extension of the Soviet state's ground control grid. The Su-9 was stripped of a gun, stripped of an internal navigation system capable of independent routing, and stripped of aerodynamic forgiveness. It was essentially a manned surface-to-air missile, and the human being strapped into the ejection seat was viewed by the engineers and the rigid Soviet air defense doctrine as little more than a biological actuator. This aircraft represents the ultimate paradox in Cold War aviation. Aerospace engineers went to extraordinary lengths to design a jet capable of blistering speeds and stratospheric altitudes, solving immense thermodynamic and aerodynamic challenges to field a world-class interceptor. Yet, simultaneously, the doctrinal requirements deliberately crippled the operational autonomy of the machine. The Soviet National Air Defense Forces, the PVO Strany, looked at the vast, desolate expanses of Siberia and the Arctic, looked at the encroaching threat of American heavy bombers, and decided that the human pilot was the weakest link in the chain. They engineered an aircraft that actively fought its own operator, demanding total reliance on a ground-controlled datalink system that, in the heat of a real-world scramble, often pushed both pilot and machine beyond their absolute limits. If you enjoy detailed deep dives into military engineering and the strategic doctrines that shape these incredible machines, subscribe to the channel. I've got a lot more planned. We are going to take apart the Su-9 piece by piece to understand exactly how the paranoid pursuit of absolute control created one of the most uncompromising aircraft in aviation history. To understand the mechanical compromises of the Sukhoi Su-9, codenamed Fishpot by NATO, you have to understand the specific nightmare keeping Soviet high command awake in the mid-1950s. The Strategic Air Command of the United States was fielding fleets of B-47 Stratojets and B-52 Stratofortresses. These bombers were designed to penetrate Soviet airspace at high altitudes, delivering catastrophic payloads across the vast, radar-sparse northern frontier. Traditional dogfighters like the MiG-15 and MiG-17, which had dominated the skies over Korea, were practically useless for this mission. They lacked the radar to find the bombers in the dark or in weather. They lacked the speed to catch them quickly, and they lacked the altitude performance to engage them before they released their payloads. The mandate handed down to Soviet design bureaus was uncompromising. They needed an interceptor that could take off, accelerate to Mach 2, climb to 65,000 feet, fire a payload of guided missiles, and return. Maneuverability was irrelevant. Loiter time was irrelevant. Dogfighting capability was not just ignored. It was actively discarded to save weight. Pavel Sukhoi, a brilliant designer who had spent years in political exile under Stalin before being rehabilitated, took on this challenge with the T-3 prototype, which would eventually evolve into the Su-9. To achieve the required speed and altitude, Sukhoi's engineers consulted with TSAGI, the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute. TSAGI recommended a pure delta wing configuration. The delta wing solved a massive technical problem for the Su-9. As an aircraft approaches and exceeds the speed of sound, the center of lift shifts rearward, and the aerodynamic drag increases exponentially. A swept wing like that on earlier MiGs suffers from aeroelastic twisting at extreme speeds. The wing literally bends, altering the angle of attack and potentially causing loss of control. A delta wing, however, is a massive, structurally rigid triangle. It provides an enormous internal volume for fuel, which is strictly necessary when feeding a thirsty afterburning turbojet, and its broad chord length offers incredible structural strength without requiring heavy internal bracing. In the supersonic regime, the delta wing slices through the air with minimal wave drag, allowing the Su-9 to sprint toward its target with brutal efficiency. But this structural triumph came with a severe aerodynamic toll that the pilots had to pay every time they brought the aircraft home. The delta wing generates lift highly efficiently at supersonic speeds, but at low speeds, its lift profile collapses. To maintain flight at low speeds, a delta wing requires a very high angle of attack. The nose must be pointed sharply upward to force the air over the wing and create vortex lift. For the Su-9 pilot, this meant the approach and landing phases were notoriously unforgiving. The aircraft had to be flown to the runway at terrifyingly high speeds. The final approach speed hovered around 350 kilometers per hour, requiring the pilot to balance on a knife edge of throttle control and pitch. If the pilot let the airspeed drop even slightly, the delta wing would lose its lift, and the aircraft would drop like an anvil. Because the nose had to be held so high during the flare, forward visibility was severely restricted. The pilot was essentially peering over a long metallic snout, trying to judge the flare height while managing a descent rate that felt more like a controlled crash. Once the tires hit the concrete, the sheer speed required the immediate deployment of dual cruciform drogue parachutes just to keep the aircraft from running off the end of the runway. The problem of feeding the aircraft's massive engine further complicated the aerodynamic shape. The Su-9 utilized a nose inlet design characterized by a prominent center body shock cone. At supersonic speeds, air entering a jet engine must be slowed down to subsonic velocities before it hits the compressor blades. If supersonic air strikes the compressor, it causes catastrophic stalls and engine failure. The sharp tip of the shock cone generates a shock wave that slows the incoming air. As the aircraft accelerates, this cone automatically translates forward or backward to precisely position the shock wave in relation to the inlet lip, ensuring the engine receives a steady flow of subsonic air. However, Sukhoi's engineers were faced with a conflicting requirement. They needed the nose for the engine inlet, but they also needed a place to put the radar. The solution was an extreme packaging compromise. They stuffed the entire RP-9U airborne interception radar, vacuum tubes, wiring, and the scanning dish itself inside that translating center body cone. This nested engineering challenge solved the packaging issue, but created massive operational limitations. Because the radar was confined to a small, aerodynamically restricted cone, the dish size was severely limited. In radar physics, the size of the antenna directly correlates to the range and resolution of the system. The RP-9U, constrained by the physical dimensions of the shock cone, was dreadfully myopic. Under ideal conditions, it could detect a bomber-sized target at perhaps 20 kilometers. In real-world weather or against electronic countermeasures, that range shrank dramatically. The interceptor was technically equipped with radar, but it was virtually blind on its own. It could not hunt. It could only look at what was placed directly in front of it. This brings us to the beating heart of the Su-9, the Lyulka AL-7F afterburning turbojet. If the airframe was a testament to uncompromising speed, the engine was a monument to brute force. The AL-7F was a massive, heavy, single-spool turbojet capable of producing nearly 20,000 pounds of thrust with the afterburner engaged. It was this engine that gave the Su-9 its phenomenal climb rate and its Mach 2 top speed. But brute force is rarely refined. The AL-7F was notorious for its temperamental nature, particularly its susceptibility to compressor stalls. Because it was a single spool design, all the compressor stages spun on a single shaft. If the airflow entering the engine was disrupted, perhaps because the pilot pulled too hard on the control stick and increased the angle of attack, blanking out the intake, the compressor blades would suddenly lose their aerodynamic grip on the air. The high-pressure air in the combustion chamber would forcefully blow back out the front of the engine in a violent concussive event. The aircraft would shudder aggressively, thrust would vanish instantly, and the pilot would have to rapidly retard the throttle, pitch down to restore airflow, and attempt to nurse the engine back to life. In a high-altitude intercept, where the air is incredibly thin and the margins for error are microscopic, a compressor stall often meant failing the mission entirely. Furthermore, the AL-7F was astonishingly inefficient. It consumed fuel at a staggering rate, meaning the Su-9 was strictly a point defense sprinter. It had no loiter time. The operational profile was heavily dictated by fuel fraction, scramble, ignite the afterburner, climb directly to altitude, fire the payload, and immediately declare an emergency fuel state for the return trip. External drop tanks were absolutely mandatory just to get the aircraft off the ground and up to altitude with enough internal fuel to make it back. This short range and limited onboard radar created the central conflict of the Su-9's design. If the aircraft could not fly far enough to patrol and its radar could not see far enough to search, how was it supposed to intercept a threat? The answer lay in the state's absolute reliance on ground-controlled interception, or GCI. The Soviet PVO integrated the Su-9 into a massive automated command and control network known as Vozduk-1. The pilot was entirely dependent on a datalink system called Lazur. Here is how an intercept was theoretically supposed to work. Massive early warning radars on the ground would detect an incoming American bomber. Ground tracking stations would feed the target's speed, altitude, and heading into early analog computers. These computers would calculate an intercept geometry. The ground controller would then transmit steering commands directly to the Su-9 via the Lazur datalink. Inside the cockpit, the pilot did not look at a radar screen displaying a map of the airspace. Instead, they watched the command needles on their flight director. If a needle pointed left, the pilot banked left. If the needle pointed up, the pilot pitched up. The pilot was flying blind, reacting solely to mechanical prompts generated by a ground-based algorithm. The goal was to place the Su-9 precisely a few kilometers behind the target, perfectly aligned, at which point the pilot's own anemic radar in the nose cone would finally pick up the bomber. So, after seeing the extreme lengths the engineers went to strip autonomy from the aircraft and place it in the hands of a ground network, do you think this design approach was a necessary compromise for the technology of the era, or a doctrinal failure? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Once the Su-9 was steered into position by the ground controller and the pilot achieved a lock with their own radar, the final, most terrifying phase of the intercept began: weapon delivery. The Su-9 was armed exclusively with 4 K-5M, also known as RS-2US, air-to-air missiles. These were not heat-seeking missiles, nor were they modern semi-active radar-homing missiles that merely needed the target to be illuminated. The K-5M was a beam rider. Beam riding technology represents an incredibly convoluted solution to aerial combat. When the pilot achieved a radar lock, the radar dish in the Su-9's nose stopped scanning and stared directly at the target, projecting a narrow, continuous pencil beam of radar energy. The missile was launched, and sensors mounted on the rear fins of the missile would look backward to detect this radar beam. The missile's crude internal logic sought to keep itself exactly in the center of that beam. Therefore, to guide the weapon to the target, the pilot had to keep the nose of the Su-9 pointed precisely at the bomber for the entire duration of the missile's flight. Consider the operational reality of this system. The pilot is flying at Mach 1.5 at 60,000 feet. They launch a missile. For the next 10 to 15 seconds, they must hold their aircraft perfectly steady, staring down the optical gun sight, tracking the exhaust of the bomber. They cannot turn away. They cannot evade. If they bank the aircraft, the radar beam moves off the target, the missile loses the beam, and the weapon goes ballistic. The pilot is forced into an extended high-speed collision course with the target, flying straight and level, directly into the firing arc of a B-52's radar-guided tailguns. The cognitive load and sheer nerve required to execute a beam-riding intercept at supersonic speeds is difficult to overstate. The pilot is fighting the temperamental aerodynamics of the delta wing, monitoring the prone-to-stalling AL-7F engine, constantly checking the rapidly depleting fuel gauge, and attempting to fly an impossibly smooth trajectory while closing on the target at thousands of feet per second. This rigid reliance on GCI and beam-riding missiles created a fragile operational reality. The system looked brilliant on paper, assuming all components functioned perfectly, but the dirt of real-world operations routinely shattered these assumptions. If the Lazur datalink failed, or if atmospheric conditions scrambled the telemetry, the Su-9 pilot was instantly rendered blind and useless. Without the ground controller feeding steering commands to the needles, the pilot had no situational awareness, no navigation routing, and no way to locate a target in the vast expanse of the sky. The aircraft was reduced to a remarkably fast piece of aluminum with nowhere to go. Nowhere is the brutal reality of this doctrine more clearly illustrated than in the events of May 1, 1960. On that day, Francis Gary Powers piloted an American U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft deep into Soviet airspace, photographing military installations near Sverdlovsk. The Soviet air defense network was thrown into a state of sheer panic. The U-2 was cruising above 70,000 feet, an altitude that traditional Soviet fighters simply could not reach. The PVO command ordered a desperate scramble. An unarmed Su-9 happened to be in transit near the area, piloted by Captain Igor Mentyukov. Mentyukov was not prepared for a combat mission. He was ferrying the aircraft from a factory. His jet carried no missiles, and crucially, he was not wearing the specialized high-altitude pressure suit required for operations above 50,000 feet. The ground controllers, driven by the absolute imperative of the state to stop the U-2, ordered Mentyukov to intercept anyway. The lack of weaponry was not viewed as a reason to abort. Ground control transmitted a chilling directive. Mentyukov was to use the Su-9 itself as the weapon. He was ordered to climb to the U-2's altitude and physically ram the American spy plane. This incident perfectly encapsulates the Soviet view of the interceptor pilot. Mentyukov was being ordered to execute a one-way intercept, using a complex, expensive Mach 2 machine as a kinetic battering ram, sacrificing himself simply because the ground control algorithm demanded a solution to the problem in the sky. Mentyukov accepted the order. He engaged the afterburner of his AL-7F engine, pushed the Su-9 into a steep climb, and relied entirely on the ground controllers to steer him toward a target he could not see, flying an aircraft stripped of its armament, while risking severe decompression without his pressure suit. The sheer physics of the attempt were absurd. The U-2 was a glider-like aircraft, loitering at extremely low airspeeds in the thin upper atmosphere. The Su-9 was a heavy delta-wing dart that required massive speed to stay aloft at that altitude. Mentyukov's closure rate was immense. Because he had no onboard radar to guide him in the final moments, Mentyukov was entirely dependent on the voice commands from the ground operator. But the ground radar lacked the precision necessary for a physical collision at those speeds. As Mentyukov hurtled upward, the controller gave him the command to turn slightly too late. The Su-9 slashed through the stratosphere, passing slightly behind and below the U-2. Mentyukov never even saw the American aircraft. With his speed bleeding off and his fuel rapidly draining, he was forced to abort the intercept and glide back to a terrifying engine-out landing at a divert airfield. The U-2 was eventually brought down by a volley of SA-2 surface-to-air missiles. But the Su-9's failure highlighted the catastrophic flaws in relying purely on remote control. The operational history of the Su-9 was marred by this exact type of inflexibility, compounded by an atrocious accident rate. The aircraft earned a grim reputation among Soviet aviators. The combination of the high landing speeds, the unreliable engine, and the complex avionics meant that the Su-9 demanded perfection from pilots who were afforded very little training time. Hull losses were frequent. When an engine flamed out at high altitude, the aircraft's glide ratio was frequently compared to that of a falling brick. When a pilot lost orientation during a night intercept, the lack of backup instruments and poor cockpit ergonomics often led to spatial disorientation and unrecoverable dives. Maintainers on the ground hated the aircraft just as much as some of the pilots feared it. Keeping the vacuum tube electronics of the RP-9U radar functioning in the freezing, damp conditions of Siberian air bases was a constant struggle. The AL-7F engine required frequent overhauls, and the sheer physical effort of manhandling the massive shock cone during servicing exhausted ground crews. Yet, for all its flaws, the Su-9 achieved exactly what the state commanded it to do. It provided a high-speed, high-altitude perimeter defense during the most tense years of the Cold War. It forced the United States to reconsider its high-altitude bomber penetration doctrine, eventually driving the shift toward low-level tactics. The brute force of the airframe, the staggering thrust of the Lyulka engine, and the uncompromising delta wing proved that Soviet metallurgy and aerodynamics could match anything produced in the West. The ultimate failure of the Su-9 was not in its metal, but in its mind. The aircraft was heavily restricted by a philosophy of paranoia. Compare the Su-9 to its American contemporary, the F-4 Phantom II. The Phantom was also a heavy, fast interceptor initially designed without a gun, heavily reliant on missiles. But the United States Navy and Air Force placed a radar intercept officer in the back seat, equipping the aircraft with a massive, highly capable radar dish. The Phantom was designed to hunt autonomously, allowing the crew to make tactical decisions, manage the intercept geometry, and adapt to the chaotic reality of combat. The Soviet state could not bring itself to trust the pilot with that level of autonomy. They built a magnificent supersonic spear, but insisted on throwing it while blindfolded, guided only by the shouts of observers standing miles away. The legacy of the Su-9 paved the way for subsequent Soviet interceptors. The immediate successor, the Su-11, attempted to fix the radar deficiency by enlarging the nose cone to fit the more capable Oriole radar, though it retained the same flawed aerodynamic layout. The true lessons were finally applied in the legendary Su-15 Flagon, an aircraft that abandoned the nose inlet entirely in favor of side-mounted intakes, freeing up the entire nose for a massive radar dish, and finally giving Soviet interceptor pilots the situational awareness they had been denied for a decade. The Su-9 stands as a stark monument to a specific era of aviation history, an era where sheer speed was viewed as the ultimate solution, and where the human operator was considered a liability to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. It remains one of the most specialized, uncompromising, and ultimately flawed machines of the Cold War. If you liked this deep dive into the engineering and history of the Su-9, leaving a like helps get it out to other military history fans, and it tells the algorithm that this type of technical content is worth sharing. Thanks for being here.